The Global Cacophony. The biological shift happens entirely overnight. Humanity wakes up not to a beautiful magical miracle, but to a terrifying, deafening, and violently inescapable wall of heavy global noise. Billions of insects, birds, and rodents aggressively and violently broadcast their most basic primal instincts in perfect human languages. The walls of every single house aggressively vibrate with the terrifying high-speed chatter of spiders and termites. Forests violently erupt into a massive, heavy, psychotic symphony of hunger, fear, and aggressive mating calls. The human brain is mathematically unequipped to process this overwhelming, terrifying volume of conscious biological data. The concept of silence is violently and entirely erased from reality. People violently collapse in the streets, aggressively clutching their ears as the sheer heavy mass of a sentient, screaming ecosystem violently shatters their psychological equilibrium on the very first day, trapped in a heavily suffocating, invisible prison of raw, unapologetic animal consciousness. The beautiful illusion of nature violently and aggressively morphs into a massive, terrifying auditory nightmare, locking humanity completely inside a deafening, inescapable global asylum. The Slaughterhouse Symphony. The global agricultural grid violently and aggressively collapses within exactly 48 hours. The industrial meat machine, perfectly calibrated for silent, heavy slaughter, violently hits a terrifying psychological wall. Factory farm workers are aggressively and violently paralyzed as millions of cows, pigs, and chickens suddenly beg for their lives in clear, agonizing human sentences. The terrifying, deafening screams of genuine existential terror violently echo out of the slaughterhouses, mathematically destroying the psychological capacity of anyone holding a flat silver blade. The beautiful, sanitized illusion of the grocery store meat aisle violently shatters. Entire populations violently and aggressively vomit at the dinner table, unable to consume the heavily processed flesh of a creature that mathematically begged for mercy. Global supply chains violently snap, and massive, heavy starvation aggressively sweeps across the planet as humanity aggressively starves rather than face the terrifying, inescapable guilt of conscious, vocalized murder. The exact biological concept of human carnivorous behavior is violently and aggressively eradicated, heavily replacing our absolute apex dominance with a terrifying, paralyzing, and completely inescapable collective trauma that violently starves our species from the inside out. The Domestic Betrayal. The comforting, warm illusion of the loyal domestic pet violently and entirely shatters into heavy, terrifying fragments. Humanity aggressively realizes that dogs and cats do not possess deep, romantic human love. They possess terrifying, repetitive, and violently aggressive biological demands. Living rooms violently transform into terrifying psychological hostage situations. Cute dogs aggressively and violently scream for heavy, endless calories, entirely devoid of empathy. Cats perfectly and terrifyingly verbalize their deep, calculating hatred and violent predatory thoughts toward their owners. The heavy, warm concept of human-animal bonding is violently erased, heavily replaced by a terrifying, mathematically cold transactional reality. Millions of beloved pets are violently and aggressively abandoned in the flat gray streets, transforming once quiet suburban neighborhoods into massive, heavy, screaming mobs of angry, confused, and aggressively demanding predators perfectly capable of verbally organizing violent attacks on their former human masters. The absolute sanctuary of the human home is violently, completely, and aggressively violated, turning the comforting presence of a loyal companion into a heavy, terrifying, and inescapable psychological nightmare that violently watches you perfectly from the heavy shadows of your own living room. The Vermin Blackmail. The dark, unseen shadows of the global megacities violently and aggressively weaponize their newfound weapons. Billions of heavy, disease-ridden rats, feral pigeons, and terrifyingly massive cockroaches instantly and mathematically realize the absolute power of human language. They violently and aggressively transition from mindless scavengers to terrifying, highly organized extortionists. They live perfectly inside the heavy, dark walls of every single home, aggressively listening to every terrified human secret. The vermin violently blackmail the human population, threatening to aggressively scream at all hours of the night or violently reveal deep psychological secrets unless they are heavily provided with massive caloric offerings. City streets aggressively and violently echo with the terrifying, high-pitched demands of a heavily organized, mathematically calculating underclass of biological pests that entirely and aggressively control the psychological well-being of the human population, completely turning the cities into heavy, unlivable biological prisons. The absolute heavy dominance of human civilization is violently and terrifyingly brought perfectly to its knees by an invisible, heavily organized, and violently screaming army of mathematically cunning pests that absolutely refuse to be silenced, aggressively twisting their parasitic existence into a terrifying psychological dictatorship.
The empathy collapse. The fragile human brain is mathematically and entirely unequipped to process the terrifying heavy volume of global suffering that is suddenly violently broadcast into the air. Every single second of the day, humans aggressively and unavoidably hear the terrifying panicked screams of a small animal violently hunted by a predator, or the heavy agonizing groans of a stray creature violently starving to death in a cold alleyway. The absolute barrier of willful ignorance violently and aggressively shatters. This non-stop, terrifying auditory bombardment of pure, unadulterated biological agony violently overloads the human capacity for empathy. The global population violently plummets into a massive, heavy, terrifying state of absolute psychological shock. People violently board up their geometric windows and aggressively isolate themselves in entirely soundproofed, pitch-black geometric rooms, terrified and completely unable to function. The sheer heavy weight of nature's endless, mathematical cruelty aggressively and violently breaks the human mind entirely in half. Global mental health systems violently and aggressively implode completely, leaving humanity trapped in a terrifying, inescapable loop of heavy, screaming biological despair that violently and aggressively erases absolutely any hope of psychological recovery.
The Apex Retaliation. Driven completely and utterly to the absolute brink of violent, terrifying madness by the heavy, inescapable cacophony of animal demands and screaming agony, humanity violently snaps. The heavy, paralyzing guilt aggressively and violently mutates into a terrifying, cold, and mathematically calculated absolute rage. To survive the psychological slaughter, the human species violently and aggressively decides to entirely silence the noise at any horrifying cost. A terrifying, heavily organized global extermination campaign is violently launched. Humanity aggressively weaponizes massive, heavy chemical toxins and towering, inescapable geometric walls of fire to completely eradicate the screaming biological masses. The Earth violently and aggressively transforms into a terrifying, heavily scorched active war zone. Humans violently hunt down anything that speaks, mathematically and aggressively erasing entire ecosystems simply to reclaim the heavy, precious silence that their fragile, terrified brains absolutely require to avoid complete and permanent biological collapse. The beautiful, vibrant tapestry of nature is violently, heavily, and aggressively burned completely to the ground by a terrified, sleep-deprived, and violently psychotic human race that mathematically refuses to share the heavy burden of global consciousness.
The Hive Mind Mutation. While humanity violently and aggressively attempts to exterminate the deafening noise, a terrifying, unforeseen biological horror violently emerges. The massive, heavy swarms of highly social insects, ants, bees, and wasps aggressively utilize their new language to perfectly mathematically synchronize their collective intelligence. They violently and aggressively transcend their basic instincts, forming a colossal, heavy, terrifyingly intelligent global superorganism. This massive insect hive mind aggressively coordinates devastating, mathematically perfect counterattacks against the heavy human populations. They violently and aggressively infiltrate the global electrical grid, heavy water supplies, and flat agricultural remaining crops, entirely communicating in cold, highly organized, and mathematically precise human syntax. The terrified human species is violently and aggressively outmaneuvered by a terrifying, microscopic army that entirely lacks human fear, violently and aggressively plunging the global megacities into absolute, heavy, and completely inescapable biological darkness. The absolute arrogance of human intelligence is violently, entirely, and aggressively shattered by a heavy, unified, and terrifyingly silent geometric swarm that mathematically calculates the perfect, inescapable erasure of the human species. The Silent Planet. The heavy, terrifying global war eventually and violently burns itself entirely out, leaving behind a heavily scorched, completely dead geometric ash planet. Humanity mathematically succeeds in silencing the deafening, terrifying biological noise, but the price is absolutely absolute. The beautiful, vibrant ecosystems are violently and aggressively erased, completely replaced by a heavy, terrifying, flat gray global wasteland. The massive, heavy oceans are entirely empty, and the heavy black skies are completely devoid of any screaming birds. The terrified, heavy survivors violently lock themselves inside towering, thick, flat, pitch-black geometric concrete bunkers, completely surrounded by an absolute, terrifying, and completely unmoving silence. The grand miracle of animal communication violently and aggressively became the ultimate, inescapable planetary curse. Humanity mathematically survived, but they violently and completely eradicated the entire concept of life around them. They are left aggressively, entirely, and terrifyingly alone in a completely dead, heavy silence. The Earth violently and aggressively drifts perfectly through the terrifying, empty void of space, locked entirely in a perfectly dead, heavily static equilibrium, where the only sound left is the heavy, terrified, and entirely isolated beating of the human heart.